If you play League of Legends for any length of time, you're likely to quickly come across the phrase crowd control, or CC for short. Crowd control is a blanket term used to describe effects which negatively alter how a unit is able to perform actions during the game. Colloquially, players break crowd control down into two large categories. These are soft CC and hard CC. These are not well defined terms, and what one player might consider soft CC another player might consider hard CC, but generally speaking things like slows and silences are considered soft CC because players are still able to move around and perform most actions, whereas things like stuns and suppressions are considered hard CC because many actions are not possible during these effects. As of the recording of this video, there are 163 champions in League of Legends, the vast majority of which have some form of crowd control in their kit. Outside of that, there are also items and runes which produce some form of crowd control, along with parts of the in-game environment such as plants or monsters. On top of all of that, there are also interactions with crowd control to consider, through things like tenacity, cleanse, Mikhails, and that list goes on. All of that is to say that crowd control is a prominent part of League of Legends, and I think it's important that players understand how it works. That is why I dislike the high-level, ambiguous categorization that most players use, i.e. hard CC versus soft CC. Instead, I believe each form of crowd control should be considered individually and understood as a standalone effect. This video aims to provide a more in-depth look at each form of crowd control and will aim to provide a concise summary that players can learn from and use in their games. With all the champions, items, runes, etc. that impact how crowd control works, it simply isn't feasible for me to go into every single interaction. But I do hope that this video goes into slightly more detail than most people will be considering while they play the game. One of the difficult things when it comes to talking about CC is nomenclature. For example, the first CC we're going to look at is Airborne, which many people generalise as knock-ups. The difficulty is that knock-ups are actually a form of Airborne. Other forms of Airborne include things like knockbacks and pulls. Where possible, I'm going to try and use the highest level description of each form of crowd control that I can, just to keep things as clear as possible. And with all that said, let's look at our first crowd control, Airborne. As I've just mentioned, Airborne is a form of crowd control which can come about from several different types of abilities. These are knock-ups, knockbacks, knock-asides, and pulls. Examples of each of them are as follows. Malphite Ultimate is a knock-up, Vi Q is a knockback, Draven E is a knock-aside, and Thresh Q is a pull. During Airborne, players can't move, basic attack, or cast abilities. Making a champion Airborne will interrupt channels, and it will prevent the use of movement creating summoner spells, like Flash, but it will not prevent the use of other summoner spells like Barrier. Tenacity has no effect on Airborne. Countering Airborne is interesting because firstly the most common forms of CC removal such as QSS or Cleanse have no effect on Airborne. For cleansing effects that do impact Airborne, you really need to think of it in two parts. Firstly, there is a displacement effect which physically moves the target. Secondly, there is the actual airborne status, which is what prevents the target from being able to move or attack. You can clear the displacement effect by buffering a dash or blink such as Ezreal E, but this doesn't remove the airborne status. You can clear the airborne status with certain abilities such as GP's Remove Scurvy. That is why in this clip I'm able to use Gangplank's W during Alistar's knockup to cleanse the airborne status and then flash before I hit the ground. Now let's move on and talk about blind. There is only one champion in the game who has a blind, and that is Teemo with his Q. While blinded, you're still able to move and cast abilities, blind will not interrupt, nor will it affect summoner spells, and tenacity will reduce blind duration. While blind, you're able to declare basic attacks, but these attacks will miss the target. In terms of countering blind, as mentioned, it is reduced by tenacity, and it can also be cleared with cleanse or QSS, but notably not Mikhails. Cripple is a form of crowd control which reduces the attack speed of the target. Nasus Wither, Fiora Riposte and Malphite Ground Slam are examples of this effect. While crippled, you're still able to move and cast abilities. Cripple will also not interrupt nor will it affect summoner spells. Tenacity will reduce cripple duration. Cripple can be cleared by essentially all cleansing effects. Let's move on to Disarm next. Disarm is a form of crowd control which prevents a unit from being able to declare basic attacks. Disarm has no impact on player movement or ability casting, nor does it interrupt or affect summoner spells. Tenacity will reduce the duration of Disarm. Quinn's confusingly named Blinding Assault is an example of a Disarm, although it does only affect non-champions. In terms of countering Disarm, as previously mentioned, Tenacity will reduce the duration of Disarm, but it can also be cleared by most cleansing effects, but notably not Mikhails. Next up, let's talk about forced actions. Forced actions may not be a term that you're used to, but forced actions basically include Charm, Taunt and Fear, and although each of these forms of crowd control do work slightly differently, i.e. Fear forces a unit to move away from the source, whereas Charm forces a unit to move towards a source, they actually all have the same underlying foundations. While under a forced action, you do not have control of your movement or your basic attacks, you can't cast abilities, and forced actions will interrupt channels. You're unable to use movement related summoner spells such as Flash, but you're still able to use other summoner summoner spells like Barrier. Tenacity will reduce the duration of forced actions. In terms of countering forced actions, along with Tenacity, essentially all cleansing effects are effective. Now let's talk about grounds. Ground generally comes in the form of some specified area of effect rather than by directly targeting a unit. Some examples of grounds are Cassiopeia's Miasma and Singed Mega Adhesive. The key impact of ground is on movement abilities. While grounded, a unit is unable to activate movement spells, including summoner spells. Ground will also interrupt movement-based channels. In terms of countering grounds, Tenacity is generally ineffective against AoE-based grounds, but it can be useful against time-based grounds, such as Poppies. The same goes for cleanses. Moving on to Nearsight next. Nearsight is a form of CC which reduces a unit's sight range and prevents the unit from being able to see beyond that sight range. Examples of Nearsight come from Nocturne's Ultimate and Quinn's Blinding Assault. Nearsight does not affect movement or summoner spells, but it will prevent the player from being able to target units outside of their sight radius with basic attacks or abilities. Tenacity has no effect on Nearsight. Nearsight can be cleared by some cleanses, but notably not Mikhail's or Cleanse itself. Let's talk about Polymorph next. Polymorph is the signature ability of Lulu, and currently she is the only champion in the game who has a Polymorph. During Lulu's Polymorph, a unit can still move, but they're unable to attack or cast abilities. Polymorph will interrupt channels and prevents the use of movement-related summoner spells. Tenacity does affect the duration of Polymorph. Polymorph is a little bit strange because at its base level it's a silence, which we'll talk about later. However, the only current example in the game also disarms and slows the unit. If another Polymorph is released at a later date, it's possible that it might not also prevent basic attacks and slow movement speed like Lulu's. In terms of countering Polymorph, it can be cleared with essentially all cleanses. Let's talk about Root next. Root is a form of crowd control which focuses on immobilising an enemy's movement. Examples of Root include Lux's Light Binding and Jinx's Flame Chompers. When rooted, a unit cannot move, but they can basic attack and cast non-movement related abilities. Root will interrupt the majority of movement channels and will prevent the use of movement related summoner spells. The duration of Root is affected by Tenacity. In terms of countering Root, it can be cleared with essentially all cleanses. Silence is up next. Silence is a form of crowd control which focuses on countering ability casting. Examples of Silence come from Cho'Gath's Feral Scream and Garen's Decisive Strike. During Silence, a unit can still move and basic attack is normal, but they cannot cast abilities. Silence will interrupt channels and will prevent the use of non-movement related summoner spells. Tenacity does reduce the duration of Silence. In terms of countering Silence, it can be cleared with essentially all cleanses. Next I'm going to talk about Drowsy and then Sleep because they're very related. Drowsy is a form of crowd control which occurs before a unit falls asleep. Zoe and Lilia are the only two champions in the game who can inflict Drowsy and therefore sleep. During Drowsy, a unit has reduced movement speed but otherwise is not impaired. Tenacity will not affect Drowsy. In terms of countering Drowsy, you're able to clear the slowing effect with essentially all cleanses, and if you're able to clear the debuff, you will not fall asleep. Speaking of Sleep, Sleep is the continuation of Drowsy. As mentioned, the only two champions who can inflict sleep are Zoe and Lilia. While asleep, units cannot move, attack, or cast abilities. Sleep will act as an interrupt, and it will prevent the use of non-movement related summoner spells. Tenacity does reduce the duration of Sleep. Sleep can be removed by essentially all cleanses, or by taking non-insignificant, non-persistent damage, which basically means damage that doesn't come from minions, the regular jungle camps, or damage over time effects. Next up, let's talk about Slow. Slow is by far the most common crowd control in League of Legends. There are countless examples from champion abilities, items, and even runes, so I won't go into any specifics. When slowed, units have their movement speed reduced. Slow does not prevent a unit from basic attacking, casting abilities, or using summoner spells. Slow does not act as an interrupt, but Tenacity will reduce the duration of slows. In terms of countering Slow, it can be cleared by essentially all cleanses, and as mentioned, the duration is reduced by Tenacity. In addition, Boots of Swiftness can be purchased to reduce the strength of slows. Now let's talk about Stasis. Stasis is an interesting form of crowd control because it's normally self-inflicted. In terms of examples, Bard is able to stasis enemies and allies, but stasis also occurs when Scion is awaiting reanimation through his passive, or when a unit activates Zhonya's Hourglass. During stasis, a unit cannot move, attack, cast abilities, or summoner spells. Stasis will interrupt channels and it's unaffected by Tenacity. During stasis, units become invulnerable and untargetable. Basically, you become a golden statue on the map. In terms of countering stasis, there really isn't anything. There's no way to remove the stasis debuff. Next up, we're going to talk about stuns and suspension. Suspension is another really niche crowd control, a bit like Polymorph. It's basically a stun with some added little bits. The only champion in the game who has a suspension is Nami with her Aqua Prison. Examples of regular stuns include Anivia's Flash Frost and Twisted Fate's Gold card. During a stun, a unit cannot move, basic attack or cast abilities. Stun will interrupt channels and it will prevent the use of movement related summoner spells. Tenacity will reduce the duration of stuns. What I've just said also applies to Suspension, however Suspension can also interrupt dashes which stun does not. For example, if a Vi dashes at Anivia with her Q and Anivia lands her stun, the Vi will still complete the dash. Whereas if Vi charges at Nami and Nami lands her Q, the Vi's dash will be interrupted. Additionally, units that are suspended appear airborne and Yasuo can hit his ultimate on suspended champions. In terms of countering both stun and suspension, basically all cleansing effects in the game will work. Next up is Suppression. Suppression is perhaps the strongest form of crowd control in the game as it stands. It almost entirely locks down a unit. An example of Suppression is Warwick's ultimate. During Suppression, a unit cannot move, attack, cast abilities or summoner spells. Suppression will also interrupt channels and Tenacity has no effect on Suppression. Despite all this, Suppression can be cleared, but notably not by Cleanse or Mikhail's. Lastly, I want to talk about another niche crowd control which some people call Kinematics, but the game just refers to it as drags. This crowd control is unique to Rel's ultimate. During Kinematics, enemies are dragged towards Rel, but they can still basic attack, cast abilities and use summoner spells as normal. Kinematics is not an interrupt and it is not affected by Tenacity. You can't cleanse Kinematics as it's just an area of effect, but you can just leave the area affected. Poor Rel. Forgotten about, last on my list. Terrible crowd control. And that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Any feedback is very much appreciated, and if you want to see more content like this, like and subscribe.